She traveled 1,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met, and arrived as a body someone left for dead. Rosalie Vane had one letter, one name, and one desperate reason to disappear into the Wyoming frontier. But before she ever reached the ranch, before she ever saw the face of the man waiting for her, someone caught up with her first. They took everything. They broke what they could, and they left her beneath an old sycamore tree in a blood-soaked burlap sack, certain she would never speak again. They were wrong, because a rancher named Elias Crow rode his fence line that morning, because his 4-year-old daughter pointed at a shape in the shadows that shouldn't have been there, because the woman they tried to erase was still breathing, barely, impossibly, with his letter still clutched in her hand. What Rosalie carried inside her broken memory would bring down powerful men and shake the ground beneath an entire criminal network. What Elias carried inside that quiet, stubborn heart of his would turn out to be something neither of them expected. This is not a love story that begins with a kiss. It begins with a woman in the dirt and a man who chose not to walk away. If that's the kind of story you stay for, hit like, subscribe to join this family, and drop your city and country in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The letter had taken 11 weeks to reach Wyoming. Elias Crow knew because he had counted. 11 weeks since he'd sent it east through a correspondence bureau in Cheyenne, written in the careful, halting script of a man who didn't write much and knew it. He hadn't been proud of that letter. He'd rewritten it 4 times at the kitchen table with Lily asleep in the next room, scratching out sentences that sounded too desperate or too cold, trying to find some middle ground between honest and bearable. What he'd finally sent was something like, "I'm a widower with a daughter of 4 years. I raise cattle on a modest spread outside of Black Hollow. I am not a romantic man, but I'm a decent one, and I will treat you with respect and fairness if you are willing to make a life here." He hadn't mentioned how quiet the house had become since May died. Hadn't mentioned that Lily sometimes stood at the window at dusk, looking out at the road like she was waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. Some things you couldn't put in a letter to a stranger. The reply came from a woman named Rosalie Vane, written in a clean, educated hand that surprised him. She said she was 26, had worked in institutional care in the East, and was not afraid of hard work or hard country. She said she had reasons for wanting to start over somewhere new, and that she respected a man who was honest about what he was offering rather than what he wasn't. She would come west in the spring, she wrote. She would arrive by the 3rd week of April if the roads and weather cooperated. He'd read that letter probably a dozen times, not because it was romantic, because it was practical in a way that settled something in him. This was a woman who knew what she was walking into, and she was walking into it anyway. April came. Then the 3rd week of it passed. Elias rode into Black Hollow twice to check if any stage had come through carrying a woman traveling alone. The first time, the station master shook his head. The second time, a week later, same answer. No unaccompanied women. No luggage matching the description he'd given. Nothing. He told himself the roads were bad, that she'd been delayed, that a woman traveling across half the country alone was subject to any number of setbacks that had nothing to do with him or the agreement they'd made. Lily asked about her every night for 2 weeks. "Is the lady coming, Papa?" "Not yet, Bug." "But she said she was coming." "I know." "Did she change her mind?" He didn't answer that one. He just smoothed her hair back and told her to sleep. By the end of May, he had mostly convinced himself that Rosalie Vane had, in fact, changed her mind, or that something had happened to her on the journey that he'd never know about. The frontier swallowed people. It always had. You sent a letter into the world, and sometimes the world sent nothing back. He was still telling himself this on the morning he rode the south fence line with Lily sitting in front of him on the saddle the way she liked, her small hands gripping the horn, her blonde hair blown sideways by the early summer wind. She spotted it first. "Papa, what's that?" He almost missed it. The old sycamore at the edge of the creek bed was heavy with new leaves, and the ground beneath it was deep in shadow, but something was wrong with the shape of things under that tree. There was a trunk half buried in the brush, split along one side, clothing spilling out of it like the guts of something broken. And beside it, half hidden beneath a burlap sack stained dark along one side, something that shouldn't have been there. "Stay on the horse," he said. He swung down before the animal fully stopped, his boots hitting the soft bank hard. He crossed the distance in a few long strides and crouched down and pulled back the edge of the sacking and then went very still. A woman. Her face was swollen on one side, purple and yellow, and cracked at the temple where the skin had split. Her lip was cut through. There was dried blood on her neck and collarbone and down the front of what had once been a traveling dress, now torn past her shoulder. Her breathing came in shallow, labored pulls, barely audible. But it came. She was breathing. "Oh, hell," he said, not to anyone, just to the air. "Papa?" Lily's voice from behind him, small and frightened. "Look at the horses, Lily. Keep your eyes on the horses." He pressed 2 fingers to the woman's throat and felt a pulse that was thin but persistent. He looked at the trunk, at the broken leather strap on it, at the scatter of clothing and a shattered glass bottle, and half buried under a root, a folded paper. A letter, he could see it from here, with a seal he recognized because he had sent one just like it months ago. The bureau in Cheyenne had its own wax mark, a small sunburst pressed into red. He picked up the letter. His own name was on the outside of it. Mr. Elias Crow, Black Hollow, Wyoming Territory. Written in a clean, educated hand. He stood up and looked down at the woman in the dirt and understood what he was looking at. This was Rosalie Vane, the bride he had been waiting for. He had to make decisions fast, and he made them without thinking too hard about any of them. He wrapped her in his coat and rode back to the ranch at a pace that probably scared Lily half to death, the woman lying across his lap unconscious, her head against his chest. He got her inside and onto the bed in the back room and sent Lily to get water from the pump, and then stood in the doorway for a second trying to remember what he knew about wounds. Not much. May had been the one who'd known things like that. He knew enough to clean the cuts and wrap the worst of them. Knew enough to check her skull with his hands, slow and careful, feeling for anything that moved wrong. The gash at her temple was deep and had been there long enough to start closing on its own, which was the only thing that kept him from writing for the doctor in Black Hollow immediately. He didn't want to leave her alone with Lily that far from help. Instead, he sent a hand, young Davis, 16 and reliable enough for simple tasks, into town with a note for Doc Hennessy. "Don't tell him much," Elias said. "Just say I need him out here before dark." Davis nodded and rode. Lily stood in the doorway of the back room, watching the woman in the bed with the serious, solemn expression she got when she was trying to understand something adult and difficult. "Is she going to die?" she asked. "No," Elias said, with more certainty than he felt. "Are you sure?" "I'm not sure of most things in this world, Bug, but I'm working on that one." Doc Hennessy arrived 2 hours before dark, a lean man in his 50s who had seen more frontier damage than most surgeons back east would believe. He examined Rosalie without much comment, his face professionally blank, and when he came out of the back room he washed his hands at the basin and looked at Elias for a long moment before he said anything. "She's been beaten, badly. The head wound's the most serious. She's taken a blow that would have killed someone with less fight in them." He dried his hands. 3 broken ribs on her left side. Deep bruising over most of her torso. The cuts will heal. The ribs will heal. The head, he paused. If she wakes up and the fever doesn't take her, she may have gaps, memory, thinking. Hard to say yet. Will she wake up? She's still breathing after however many days she's been out there. I'd say she intends to. He picked up his bag. I'll leave you laudanum for the pain when she comes around. Keep her still. Keep her head elevated. I'll be back in 2 days. After he left, Elias sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at this woman he had never met and thought about what it meant that she was here. That she had made it 11 weeks across the country with a letter that had his name on it, and someone had done this to her, and she'd ended up beneath a sycamore tree on the edge of his own land like she had been pointed here even while being destroyed. He didn't sleep much that night. He kept waking up to check that she was still breathing. She was conscious by the second day, though barely. Her eyes opened for a few minutes at a time, dark brown and glassy with fever. And she tried to speak once and made a sound that wasn't a word and winced like the effort hurt something in her skull. Elias gave her water with a spoon and told her she was safe, which he supposed was mostly true. Lily brought her a piece of dried apple and set it on the bedside table, and then retreated to the doorway, watching. She can't eat that yet, Elias told her. I know, it's for when she can. On the third day, the fever broke. It happened sometime before dawn, the sheets soaked through, Rosalie shaking and then stilling and then breathing in a way that was deeper and steadier than it had been. When Elias checked on her at first light, her eyes were open and clear and tracking, following him across the room as he moved to the window. Water, she said. It was barely a word, just the idea of one. He brought her a cup, helped her sit up enough to drink. She got through most of it before she had to stop, her jaw clenching against some pain he couldn't see. Do you know where you are? He asked. She thought about it. No. Wyoming territory. My name is Elias Crow. I found you on my land down by the creek 3 days ago. He pulled the folded letter from his shirt pocket and held it out so she could see it without having to take it. I think this is yours. She looked at it for a long time without responding. Something moved through her expression. Recognition, maybe, or the edge of it. Then it went still again. I wrote to you, he said, through the bureau. You were coming west to... He stopped, not sure how to say it. I'm the man you were supposed to marry. Nothing in her face confirmed it. Nothing denied it either. She just looked at the letter in his hand with that same careful blankness, like she was waiting for something to click into place. I don't... She stopped, swallowed, tried again. I don't remember. The town of Black Hollow had a population of just under 300, which was enough people to generate a significant amount of opinion about other people's business. Elias had lived on its edge for 8 years, and he knew how it worked. He knew that within a few days of Doc Hennessy's visit, the story would start circulating. Some version of it, shaped and reshaped by whoever told it last. He was not wrong. A week after Rosalie woke up, he rode into town for supplies and felt the shift in the air before anyone said anything to him directly. It was in the way Delia Marsh at the dry goods store asked after his health with a little too much interest. In the way 2 men outside the saloon stopped talking when he walked past. Thomas Galt, who owned the feed store and considered himself something of an authority on community standards, stopped him on the street. Heard you got a woman out at your place, Galt said. Not unfriendly, just direct in that way men were when they decided to say something they'd been thinking for a while. That's right. The mail order? Yes. Galt chewed on whatever was in his mouth for a moment. She arrive in that condition, or she was attacked somewhere between here and wherever she came from, Elias said. Someone beat her and left her on my land. Galt's expression did something complicated, and she's staying at your place. Alone, with the girl. She's recovering from 3 broken ribs and a head wound, Thomas. She's not going anywhere. I'm not saying anything against you, Elias. I'm just saying people are wondering. She comes out here already half dead. No one saw her arrive. Nobody in town met her at the stage. She didn't come through town. That's the point. Whoever attacked her got to her before she reached town. You're certain about that? Elias looked at him. I found her with my own letter in her hand. Yeah, I'm certain. He didn't wait for a response, loaded his wagon and drove back to the ranch and didn't say anything to Rosalie about the conversation. She was sitting up in bed when he got back, feeding herself, slowly, painfully, from a bowl of broth that Lily had apparently carried in without being asked. The 2 of them were talking about something. He could hear Lily's voice going as he came through the door, some long, complicated story about a horse she'd named Biscuit. And he doesn't let anyone else ride him except Papa, but I think he's going to let me when I'm bigger, because he already lets me give him apples and he bites everyone else. That sounds like a horse with opinions, Rosalie said. Her voice was still rough, still careful around the syllables, but it was her voice now, not the papery ghost of one. He has a lot of opinions, Lily confirmed. Elias stood in the doorway without announcing himself for a moment, watching his daughter sit on the edge of a bed talking to a woman she'd never met, like she was telling secrets to an old friend. Lily hadn't talked this much to any adult who wasn't him since May died. He made more noise coming in than necessary, and Lily looked up. She laughed at my story about the spider, Lily informed him. Good story, Rosalie said, glancing at him. A pause, something careful in her expression. You were in town? Yes. Was it? She stopped. Were people asking questions? He pulled up the chair. Some. She looked down at the broth. I'm sorry. You didn't beat yourself up and leave yourself under a tree. No, but I brought whatever this is to your door. You didn't have much say in that either. She didn't respond to that. She looked at her hands, which were still wrapped in bandaging around the knuckles. She'd fought back, Hennessy had said. You could see it in the marks. And something moved through her face that she didn't let finish. Do you remember anything yet? He asked. A silence. Lily, with the instincts of a 4-year-old, slid off the bed and announced she was going to check on Biscuit and left without being asked. Pieces, Rosalie said, like looking at something through broken glass. There was a wagon. Night. I remember the sound of it going, the wheels on dry ground. And then it was just dark. She pressed her fingers against her forehead. Men's voices. I can't hear what they're saying. I just know they were... She stopped. Angry. They were looking for something. From you? I think so. I just don't know what. He leaned back in the chair. All right. She looked up. All right? You don't have to know right now. You've been awake for 5 days. Your ribs are still cracked. You're not... She seemed to be working out what she wanted to say. You're not going to ask me to leave. Where would I ask you to go? She didn't have an answer for that. You came here under an agreement, he said. I'm not saying that agreement still stands the way it was written. That's a conversation for when you're on your feet. But you're not well enough to travel, and you've got nowhere clear to travel to, so you stay until we figure out the rest of it. He stood up. You need anything before I start on supper? She was still looking at him like she was trying to find the catch in what he'd said. Like she was waiting for the version of this where it went wrong. No, she said. Thank you. Over the following 2 weeks, Rosalie got stronger. Not quickly. The ribs made everything slow, and there were days when she'd try to do something ordinary, like walk to the table and come back from it pale and shaky and have to sit down for an hour. But she was stubborn about it in a way that was easy to see once you were watching for it. She pushed against her limits the way some people push against a door that's stuck, not because they're certain it'll open, but because standing there waiting wasn't something they were built for. She started remembering more. Not the big things, not why she'd been attacked or what anyone had been looking for, but small things. Her name, fully. Where she had grown up in a mill town in Pennsylvania. The smell of a particular kitchen. The sound of children. That one stopped her every time it surfaced. She'd go quiet for a minute, whatever she'd been doing suddenly set aside, and then come back from it with her jaw tight and her eyes somewhere else. Elias didn't push. He'd seen men come back from things, bad winters, bad situations, and he knew the brain had its own timeline for what it was ready to let a person carry. She'd get there or she wouldn't. Lily made the process considerably less solemn than it might otherwise have been. She had appointed herself Rosalie's recovery companion with the absolute authority of a 4-year-old who has decided something and saw no reason to revisit the decision. She brought books to the bedside and demanded Rosalie read to her. She explained the ranch's various animals with a thoroughness that suggested she had opinions about all of them. She asked Rosalie questions that no one who was trying to be tactful would ask, with the uncomplicated directness of a child who hadn't learned yet that some things were supposed to be left unasked. Did it hurt when they hit you? She asked one afternoon. Rosalie looked at her for a moment. Yes. Were you scared? Yes. Are you scared now? A pause. A little. Less than before. Lily considered this. Papa says being scared is okay as long as you don't let it stop you. Your father sounds like he knows what he's talking about. He knows a lot of things. He doesn't know how to braid hair, though. He tried once, and it was bad. She made a face that conveyed the full catastrophe of it. I had to cut a piece out. Rosalie laughed. It came out startled and half suppressed, like she'd forgotten laughing was something she did. And then it was just a laugh, clear and brief and real. From across the room, Elias heard it and didn't look up from the harness he was mending. But something in his shoulders settled. 3 weeks after he'd found her under the sycamore, Rosalie was well enough to sit at the table for full meals and to take short walks around the yard in the morning, moving slow and careful as an old woman. Her face had healed enough to look like a face again, the swelling gone. The bruising faded to something yellowish that would be gone entirely in another week. She was different from what he'd expected. He hadn't known what to expect exactly. A voice in letters was one thing, and the woman in those letters had been practical and direct. The woman in front of him was that, but she was also watchful. She paid attention to things. She noticed when something was off, a hinge that needed oil, a board in the kitchen floor that had started to give, and she'd mention it without making a production of it. She didn't take up much space, but she was very present in whatever space she was in. He caught himself watching her sometimes and had to decide what to do with that, which was uncomfortable in a way he hadn't expected. It was on a Wednesday morning. He remembered it was a Wednesday because he'd been planning to ride the east pasture when the stranger arrived. Elias was at the fence when he heard the horse. He turned and saw a man coming up the road to the ranch at a pace that was too deliberate to be casual. Well dressed for the territory, with a dark coat and a brimmed hat, and a look about him that said money and the confidence money bought. He had two men with him, riding a little behind. They weren't cowboys. The man stopped his horse and looked down at Elias with an expression that was carefully pleasant. Elias Crow? That's right. My name is Caleb Voss. He said it like it was supposed to mean something. I'm a private investigator working in the interest of several parties who've suffered significant losses. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. I have reason to believe you're currently sheltering a woman who goes by the name Rosalie Vane. Elias said nothing. Ms. Vane is wanted in connection with an arson fire that destroyed a children's home in Warren County, Pennsylvania. 3 people died in that fire. She also removed a significant quantity of confidential records from the facility prior to the fire, records that belonged to the home's board of directors. Voss's voice was smooth and level and entirely too comfortable with itself. I'm here to take her into custody and return her to Pennsylvania to face a proper accounting. Is that right? Elias said. It is. Voss smiled. I understand you may have been deceived, Mr. Crow. She presented herself as a potential wife. These women sometimes use personal arrangements as cover for, well, he spread his hands. I'm not here to assign you blame. I'm here for the woman. Elias looked at him for a long moment. At his 2 clean hands and his 2 smooth manner and the 2 men behind him who hadn't said a word. She's not here, he said. Voss's smile stayed exactly where it was. Mr. Crow, she never arrived. I've been waiting on a woman from Pennsylvania for 2 months. She didn't show. He turned back to the fence. You've got the wrong place. A pause, long enough to be a decision. I'll be back, Voss said, with proper documentation. And if she's found on your property at that time, you'll be held as an accessory. He turned his horse and rode back down the road with his 2 men behind him. Elias watched them go and then walked back to the house. Rosalie was in the kitchen, standing very still at the window that faced the road. She'd heard it, maybe all of it. He stopped in the doorway. Her face had gone the color of chalk. Her hands were flat against the windowsill like she needed the support. And she was staring out the window at the retreating figures of the 3 riders with an expression he hadn't seen on her yet. Not fear. Something past fear. Something that looked like recognition. Rosalie. She turned, slowly, like someone coming back from a long way off. You know him, Elias said. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked back at the road where the dust was still settling. I know you, she had whispered, looking at Caleb Voss's back, not to Elias, not to anyone, just to herself, like something had broken open that had been sealed shut for weeks. I think, she said, her voice very quiet, I'm starting to remember. She didn't sleep that night. Elias could hear her through the wall, not moving, not restless, just awake in the way that had a weight to it, a stillness that was different from rest. He lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the quiet and thought about Caleb Voss's face, the way the man had smiled, the specific quality of that smile, the kind that had been practiced in rooms where people didn't push back. He'd met men like that before. Not many. Enough. In the morning he found Rosalie already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of water she wasn't drinking, both hands wrapped around it like she needed something to hold on to. The dawn light came through the east window and caught the last of the bruising along her jaw, the faded yellow of it, and the scar at her temple that was going to stay. Lily was still asleep. Elias put a pan on the stove and started on eggs without saying anything. Let the silence run for a minute. Then, "You going to tell me what you remembered, or are we going to sit here until it comes up on its own?" She set the cup down. "I don't know how much of it is real. That's the problem. It comes back in pieces, and I can't always tell which pieces fit together and which ones my brain is just filling in. Tell me what you're sure of." A long pause. She looked at the window. Outside, the morning was gray and still, the yard empty, the fence posts just visible through the glass. "His name," she said. "I'm sure of that. Caleb Voss." She said it with a flatness that wasn't calm. It was just what happened when feeling something got too expensive to show. I've seen that face before. Not just seen it, I've sat across a table from it. "He came to the home. To inspect," he said. "He had papers, official-looking things." She pressed her fingers to her forehead just below the scar. Hollow Creek. That's what it was called. Hollow Creek Home for Children. Elias cracked an egg into the pan and didn't speak. "I worked there," she said. I worked there for almost 2 years. It was supposed to be, there were children who had no one. Orphans mostly, some who'd been given up. The home took them in." She stopped. "That's what it was supposed to be. But it wasn't. Not only that." She pulled her hands back from the cup and put them in her lap. "I don't have all of it yet. I remember the smell of the place, the sound of it at night, how the floorboards talked. I remember the children's names. Some of them. Clara, Thomas, a boy named Micah who couldn't have been older than 6. Her voice didn't crack. It just went flat in a way that meant the same thing. And I remember that something was wrong, that I started to understand something was very wrong, and I was trying to figure out how to prove it." Elias put a plate in front of her. She looked at it like she'd forgotten what plates were for. "Eat," he said. "You can remember and eat at the same time." She picked up the fork, ate a few bites mechanically. "There was another person," she said, "a man who worked there, Daniel. He was the one who first said it out loud, that the children weren't all staying, that some of them were leaving and no one could say where they'd gone." She set the fork down. "And then there was a fire." Elias sat down across from her. "I remember the fire," she said, and her voice went somewhere else entirely when she said it, somewhere small and airless. "I remember the heat of it and the noise. It's so much louder than you think a fire would be, like the building is screaming. And I remember running. I had something with me. Papers. A box of some kind." She shook her head. "And then I remember running, and then I don't remember anything until I was in the back of a wagon in the dark, and my hands were tied." The pan was still on the stove, starting to smoke. Elias got up and moved it off the heat. "How much of that is new?" he asked. "From yesterday, from seeing him." "Most of it." She looked at her hands. "Before yesterday I had fragments. The wagon, men's voices, the word fire like a sound with no picture attached to it. Yesterday it started to..." She exhaled. "It's like a room that's been dark for a long time. Someone lit a lamp and I can see the shape of things, but the corners are still... I still can't see the corners." Lily's voice came from the hallway, groggy and morning rough. "Papa, I'm hungry." "Coming?" he called. He looked at Rosalie for a moment. "Don't make any decisions today, about Voss or about any of the rest of it. Just let it come back at its own speed." She looked up at him. "He's going to come back." "I know. He had papers. He said arson. He said 3 people died." Her jaw was tight. "If he comes back with official backing, then we deal with that when it happens." He pulled out a second plate for Lily. "He doesn't have anything that proves what he says he has, or he'd have come with a marshal the first time. He came with 2 hired hands and a smooth story. That's not a man who's operating through proper channels. That's a man who's trying to handle something quiet." She was quiet for a moment. "You figured that out fast. I've seen how legitimate authority carries itself. That wasn't it." They didn't look up from the eggs. "Eat the rest of that before Lily comes in and asks you 100 questions. Whoa. Black Hollow was a small town with a long memory and a short tolerance for uncertainty, And within a week of Caleb Voss's visit, both of those qualities were working against Elias and Rosalie. He heard the shape of it first from Jim Alcott, who ran the livery and was probably the most reliable source of information in the county, simply because everyone passed through his barn. Alcott mentioned, while Elias was settling up for a new shoe on the gray gelding, that a man matching Voss's description had been in town asking questions, staying at the boarding house, talking to people. "What kind of questions?" Elias asked. "About you, mostly, and the woman." Alcott was careful about it, neutral in that practiced way of a man who'd learned not to get pulled into other people's troubles. "About how long she'd been at your place, whether anyone in town had met her, whether you'd said anything about her." He picked up a nail. Thomas Galt talked to him for a while. So did Vera Hutchins. Elias didn't say anything to that. He paid for the shoe and drove home. The next Sunday, the thing became visible in the way that things became visible in small towns, not through any single confrontation, but through a dozen small frictions that added up. Two women who had always nodded at him on the street took a sudden interest in the opposite side of the road. A man he did occasional business with, Frank Darby, mentioned that he'd heard some concerns about the situation at the Crow Ranch, which was the kind of sentence that meant a committee of worried people had been talking without having the argument in front of him. He didn't tell Rosalie most of this. She was getting stronger and sharper every day, and what came with that was a kind of awareness that he could see in her eyes sometimes, the awareness of what her presence was costing him. She'd started to bring it up once or twice in indirect ways, saying she didn't want to be a burden, saying she could probably manage to travel soon if there was somewhere to go. He'd shut it down both times, flatly enough that she'd stopped arguing, though she hadn't stopped thinking it. It was Lily who changed the architecture of things, the way Lily often did, without trying, and without understanding that she was doing it. She'd been sick for 3 days, just a cold, the ordinary kind, but enough to flatten her, which it did with the sudden totality that illness had with small children. She ran a fever the first night that had Elias up every 2 hours checking her, and she was miserable in the specific way that sick 4-year-olds were miserable, which was completely and without reservation. Rosalie took over on the second day. She didn't announce it. She just appeared in the doorway of Lily's room in the morning with a damp cloth and took over the business of managing the fever with a calm efficiency that suggested she'd done this before. She coaxed Lily through drinking water when Lily was convinced she didn't want to. She told stories. Long, wandering stories about made-up animals that did impractical things, delivered in a low voice that pulled Lily's attention away from how bad she felt. She knew what to do when the fever spiked and when it broke, and what to watch for in between. On the second night, Elias found her still sitting on the edge of Lily's bed at midnight, the child finally asleep, one small hand loosely gripping 2 of Rosalie's fingers. Rosalie was awake and still, looking at nothing in particular, and she didn't hear him come in. He stood in the doorway for a moment and then withdrew without saying anything. In the morning, when Lily was better and demanding food, she climbed into Rosalie's lap at the table and announced, "You stayed." "Of course I stayed," Rosalie said. "All night? You were sick." Lily considered this with the gravity of someone evaluating a contract. "Okay," she said finally, apparently satisfied that the terms were acceptable, and helped herself to Rosalie's biscuit. What? 12 days after Voss's visit, Elias came home from the south pasture to find a different horse tied at his fence. Not Voss's. He'd have recognized that animal. This was a smaller bay mare, worn-looking, tied with a quick-release knot like whoever had ridden it was in a hurry or might need to leave in one. Rosalie met him at the door. Her expression was careful in a way that meant something had happened. "There's a man inside," she said quietly. "He says he knew me from before." "What's his name?" "He says his name is Henry Pratt. He says—" She stopped. "He says he was a neighbor of Hollow Creek. He heard I was here." "How?" "I don't know." Elias looked past her at the door. "You remember him?" She hesitated. "I remember the name. I don't— His face isn't something I've pulled back yet. But the name—" She nodded. "Yes." The man in the kitchen was somewhere around 50, rough-handed, with the look of someone who farmed for a living and hadn't had an easy season in a few years. He stood up when Elias came in, which was a good sign. The kind of reflex that meant he'd been raised to be respectful and hadn't unlearned it. Mr. Crow? He put out a hand. Henry Pratt. I had a small farm, 40 acres, about a mile from the home where Miss Vane worked. I rode 3 days to get here. Elias shook his hand and sat down. Why? Pratt sat back down heavily. He had the look of a man who'd been carrying something for a while and wasn't sure how to set it down. Because what they're saying about her isn't true, he said. And because I know what actually happened, and I've been scared to say it for 3 months, and I'm not able to keep being scared about it. He looked at Rosalie. I'm sorry it took me this long. Rosalie sat down across from him. Tell me what you know. He told them. He'd been there the night of the fire, not at the home. He'd been on the road nearby, coming back late from a neighboring farm, and he'd seen the light of it. He'd gone toward it because that was what you did. And when he got there, the home was already burning from 2 sides at once, which meant it had been set, because fires that started by accident didn't start that way. He'd helped get 3 of the children out. A woman had run past him carrying something. A box, he thought, and men had been chasing her. He hadn't understood what he was seeing at the time. He'd been focused on the children. But afterward, when Caleb Voss had come around asking questions and telling people a woman named Rosalie Vane had set the fire and stolen property, something hadn't sat right with Henry Pratt. He'd thought about the woman running. He'd thought about the men chasing her. The fire started from 2 sides, he said again, like it was the thing that mattered most. I've burned enough brush in my life to know what that looks like. That wasn't an accident, and it wasn't one person. That was men who knew what they were doing. The kitchen was very quiet. Did you tell anyone? Elias asked. I told my wife. Pratt looked at the table. And then 2 days later a man came by. Not Voss. One of his, I don't know what to call them. Workers, I suppose. And he told me that it would be in my family's best interest to remember that I hadn't seen anything clearly that night. That smoke and dark made things hard to see. A pause. He was very polite about it. So you stayed quiet. I've got a wife and 2 children. He said it without apology, but without pride either. Just fact. I stayed quiet until I heard she was alive. And then I thought, if she was alive, maybe she could tell what really happened. And maybe if someone else said it too. He shrugged. It was the shrug of a man who didn't know if what he was doing would be enough and was doing it anyway. Rosalie hadn't said anything for several minutes. She was looking at Henry Pratt with an expression that Elias couldn't entirely read. Gratitude, maybe, but also something harder. The weight of understanding that someone had been scared into silence on her behalf, and what that meant about the kind of people they were dealing with. The children, she said. From the home. Do you know what happened to them? Pratt's expression shifted. Most went to county. A few... He stopped. I don't know where all of them went. There were some that were there 1 week and gone the next before the fire. Nobody said much about it. She nodded, very small, very controlled. Thank you for coming, she said. I mean that. I know what it cost you. Voss came back on a Thursday, 11 days after his first visit. This time he came with a marshal. Elias saw them from the barn. 3 riders again, but this time the middle one wore a badge that caught the afternoon sun. He put down what he was doing and walked to the house first, found Rosalie in the kitchen, already looking out the window, already knowing. I see them, she said. Lily was in the back room napping. They both knew that and didn't say it. You don't have to go to the door, he said. She looked at him. If I hide in here, it proves his story. It gives us time. For what? We don't have Henry Pratt's testimony in front of any judge. We don't have anything in front of any judge. She turned back to the window. He's got a marshal. He's escalated. Elias looked at Voss on horseback in his own yard, at that same smooth, confident posture, and felt something cold move through him. Not fear exactly, something more deliberate. Let me do the talking first, he said. He went out to meet them. The marshal was a man named Culberson, 50s, weathered, who seemed about as excited to be here as a man who'd been handed someone else's problem and asked to solve it. Mr. Crow, Culberson said. He wasn't unfriendly. He was just doing a job. I've received a formal complaint from Mr. Voss here regarding a woman named Rosalie Vane. He has a warrant for her arrest on charges of arson and theft of property. I'm obligated to serve it if she's on your premises." "On what evidence?" Elias asked. Culberson looked at Voss. Voss produced a folder, smoothly, the way he did everything. "Witness statements from 2 employees of Hollow Creek Home for Children who saw Ms. Vane remove a box of records from the facility's administrative office on the night of the fire. Records belonging to the board of directors of the home. And the fire itself? The investigation concluded she was responsible." "What investigation? Mr. Crow? Who conducted it? Who signed off on that conclusion? Which county? Which authority?" Voss's smile was still in place. "These are questions for the courts in Pennsylvania, not for—" "I have a witness," Elias said. That stopped the smile for just a second, just a flicker. "A man named Henry Pratt," Elias continued. "He was on the road near Hollow Creek the night of the fire. He saw the fire start from 2 sides simultaneously. He also saw men pursuing a woman carrying a box." He looked at Voss steadily. "He's willing to make a formal statement." Culberson looked from Elias to Voss and back. "That's a claim that can be addressed in—" Voss started. "I'd like to hear more about this witness," Culberson said. His voice had shifted slightly. "Not dramatically. Just enough to mean something." Voss recovered fast. "Marshal, the warrant is properly issued. The existence of a potentially confused witness doesn't—" "I didn't say confused." Culberson looked at him. "I said I'd like to hear more." He looked back at Elias. "Is the woman here?" A pause. Rosalie came through the door. She walked out onto the porch and stood there in the afternoon light and looked at Caleb Voss directly, and whatever was in her face, it wasn't the pale, shattered thing it had been 3 weeks ago when she'd watched him ride away. She'd gotten enough of herself back to stand up straight and look a man in the eye, and she was doing it. Voss looked at her, and for the first time since he'd appeared at the ranch, something moved through his expression that wasn't controlled, something quick and tight that might have been surprise or might have been the recognition that this had gotten more complicated than he'd planned. "Ms. Vane," he said. Smooth again, almost instantly. "I'm glad to see you've recovered." "I'm sure you are," she said. Culberson looked at her. "Ma'am, I have a warrant." "I know," she said. "I also know that the charges in that warrant are false. And I know that the man who filed them is the same man who arranged for me to be beaten and left for dead in a ditch." She wasn't loud. She wasn't shaking. Her voice was level and clear and carried the specific quality of someone saying something they had decided to say and weren't going to unsay. "I have evidence of what was actually happening at Hollow Creek. I know where it's hidden, and I will provide it to any lawful authority who isn't in the pay of the people who ran that place." The yard was very quiet. Culberson looked at the warrant in his hand. Then he looked at Voss. Then he looked at Rosalie. "I'll need to look into this further," he said carefully. "Marshal," Voss started. "Mr. Voss, I am not arresting a woman recovering from serious injuries based on one-sided paperwork when the opposing party is standing right in front of me making specific counterclaims." He folded the warrant. "I'll be in Black Hollow for the next 3 days. I'd like to speak with your witness, Mr. Crow, and I'd like to hear Miss Vane's account in full." He looked at Voss with the flat patience of a man who'd worked long enough to know when he was being used. "This can be handled properly, or it can be handled fast. It will not be both." Voss said nothing. That practiced smile had gone somewhere, and what was underneath it was harder and less pleasant. He pulled his horse around and rode toward the road without another word. His 2 men followed. Culberson tipped his hat at Rosalie. "Tomorrow morning, if that works." "It works," she said. That night, after Lily was asleep and the marshal had ridden into town, the house was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Less like holding its breath. More like the moment after you've made a decision and the weight of it has settled. Not gone, but settled. Rosalie was at the kitchen table again, but this time she had a piece of paper in front of her and she was writing. Slowly, with a lot of stopping. Elias could see from across the room that she was making a list. "What's that?" he asked. "Everything I remember," she said. "I've been writing it down before I lose pieces again. Names, dates, what I saw. She looked up. Where the box is, I think I know where it is. He crossed the room and looked at the page without reading it. The records you took. I hid them before they caught me, she said. I didn't know I remembered that until tonight. I had a plan, in case something happened. Before Daniel and I were going to go to the authorities, I made a copy, and I hid it somewhere separate. Somewhere they wouldn't think to look. She pressed her hand flat against the paper. If it's still there, it would change things. It would change everything. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Then we go get it, he said. She looked at him for a moment. This was something he was starting to recognize about her. The way she looked at him when he said something she hadn't expected. Not suspicious, exactly. More like she was still recalibrating the possibility that someone meant what they said. It's in Wyoming, she said. I hid it somewhere on the road, about 2 days east of here. I remember the landmark. She hesitated. But if Voss is watching, Voss thinks you don't remember anything. He came here twice on the assumption that you were still broken. He doesn't know what you told Culberson today. Elias looked at the list on the paper. We're ahead of him right now for the first time. That doesn't last. She was quiet for a moment. Elias, she said. Not the first time she'd used his name, but she said it now like she was deciding something. I need to ask you something. Ask. Why are you doing this? She met his eyes, not challenging, genuinely asking, with the directness that was just how she was. No softening around the edges of the actual question. You don't know me. You've known me for 3 weeks, and I can't even tell you most of those weeks were me at my best. You lied to a marshal to protect me. You're talking about riding 2 days east into whatever Voss has set up along that road. A pause. The agreement we made, a letter, a marriage arrangement, you could walk away from that. Anyone would understand. He looked at the table for a second, thought about how to answer that honestly, which was the only way worth answering it. When I found you under that tree, he said, you were holding on to a letter with my name on it. You'd been beaten so bad you shouldn't have been breathing, and you were still breathing. He looked up. I don't know what kind of man walks away from that. She didn't say anything. I'm not walking away, he said. That's all. Outside, the wind had come up, moving through the grass with a sound like distant water. Lily made a small noise in her sleep in the back room, then went quiet again. Rosalie looked down at the list she'd made. At the names she'd recovered and the dates she'd put back together and the evidence she'd hidden months ago in a piece of country she now had to go back and find. She picked up the pen and kept writing. Marshal Culberson arrived at the ranch the next morning before the dew had burned off the grass. He came alone this time, which Elias took as a deliberate choice, the kind of signal a careful man sent when he wanted a conversation rather than a confrontation. He tied his horse at the fence and accepted a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with his hat on his knee and listened to Rosalie talk for nearly an hour without interrupting her more than twice. She told him everything she had written down the night before. She was methodical about it in a way that Elias suspected cost her. Methodical meant linear, and linear meant going back through it in order, which meant starting at the beginning of Hollow Creek and working forward through all of it. She kept her voice level. She didn't editorialize. She gave him names and approximate dates and physical descriptions, and she told him what she'd seen with her own eyes, and was careful to distinguish that from what she'd understood or concluded from it. Culberson wrote things down in a small notebook with a stub of pencil. When she finished, he looked over his notes for a moment and then looked at her. The box of records, he said. You believe it's still where you hid it? I believe so. I can't be certain. I didn't go back. And the location. 2 days east on the Laramie Road, there's a crossing where a dry creek bed cuts under the road, marked by a double-trunk cottonwood on the north side. I wrapped the box in oilcloth and buried it under the east root of that tree, about 18 inches down. She said it from memory, reciting it like something she'd been afraid to say out loud in case saying it made it real. I did it the morning before Daniel and I were going to contact the county authority. I wanted a copy somewhere safe, separate from us, in case something went wrong. And something went wrong that night. Yes. Culberson tapped the pencil against the notebook. Ms. Vane, I want to be straightforward with you. What you're describing, if it's accurate, is considerably larger than an arson charge and a theft warrant. What you're describing is an organized criminal operation that operated for an unknown period of time inside a licensed charitable institution. That's not something a territorial marshal handles alone. I know. Which means that even if I'm inclined to believe you, and I'll be honest, your account is more coherent and more specific than anything Voss has put in front of me, what I can do right now is limited. I'm not asking you to arrest anyone today, she said. I'm asking you to ride to that cottonwood tree with us and see what's buried there. Culberson looked at Elias. You'd come along, he said. Yes, Elias said. And the girl. She stays here. I have a hand who can watch her. He paused. Davis is reliable. Culberson looked at the window for a moment, at the yard and the empty road beyond it, clearly working through something. Then he closed the notebook. We leave tomorrow at first light, he said. I want to be on that road before Voss knows we're moving. He looked at Rosalie. Can you ride? She hadn't been on a horse since before the attack. Her ribs were better but not healed, not fully, and they both knew it. Yes, she said. They told Lily that evening. Not the details. She was 4, and the details were not for her. But enough. That Rosalie needed to go somewhere for a few days, and that Davis would be here, and that Rosalie was coming back. Lily received this information sitting on the kitchen floor with a wooden horse in her hand, her brow furrowed in the way it furrowed when she was deciding whether something was acceptable or not. Why do you have to go? She asked Rosalie. Because there's something important I have to find, Rosalie said. She was crouched down to Lily's level, which Elias had noticed she always did. She came down to where Lily was rather than talking at her from above. Something that belongs to some children who need it. What children? Children I used to take care of, before I came here. Lily thought about this. Are they okay? The question hung there for a second. Rosalie didn't look away from her. I'm going to try to make sure they are, she said. Lily looked at the wooden horse in her hand, then she held it out to Rosalie. You can take Biscuit, she said, meaning the toy, not the actual horse. He's good luck. Rosalie took it, held it carefully, the way you held something that mattered to the person giving it. I'll bring him back safe, she said. I know, Lily said, with the absolute confidence of someone who had decided to trust and wasn't going to revisit the decision. After Lily was asleep, Elias found Rosalie on the porch in the dark, the wooden horse in her palm, looking at nothing in particular. He came out and stood beside her and didn't say anything for a minute. She's going to be all right, he said, while we're gone. I know she is. Rosalie's voice was quiet. I'm not worried about that. What are you worried about? A pause. That it's not there. That someone found it. That I got people moving. You, Culberson, Henry Pratt, and there's nothing in that ground but dirt and an empty tin box. She turned the little wooden horse over in her fingers. Daniel died. He went back into that building for the children and he died. And if there's nothing in that box, then we find another way. There isn't another way. The records are the only— Oh, Rosalie. He said it quietly, and she stopped. We don't know what's in that box yet. We don't know that it's gone. What we know is what you remember putting there, and your memory has been right about everything else. He looked at the dark yard. Don't lose the fight before we get there. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You do that a lot. Talk me back from the edge of something. You do it yourself most of the time. You just need someone to point out that you're already doing it. She looked at him. In the dark, her face was mostly shadow, but he could see the line of it, the tiredness, and the decision in it. Elias, she said, Yeah. When this is over. She stopped. Started again. However it ends, I want you to know that what you did, what you're doing, it's not— She shook her head slightly, frustrated with herself. I don't have a way to say what I mean without it sounding like not enough. You don't have to say anything. I know. I want to anyway. She looked at the wooden horse one more time. You found me under a tree, and you didn't walk away. That's the whole of it. That's everything. He didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the grass, and somewhere in the dark the horses shifted in the paddock. "Get some sleep," he said. "Long ride tomorrow." She went inside. He stayed on the porch for a while longer, looking at the road that ran past his land toward the east, thinking about what was at the end of it. They rode out at first light, the three of them, and the road east was empty and gray in the early morning, the country wide and flat and indifferent the way Wyoming country was. Rosalie rode between Elias and Culberson, setting a pace that was careful rather than slow. She was managing the ribs, he could tell, compensating for the movement of the horse with a tightness through her torso that probably cost her more than she showed. She didn't complain. She didn't ask to stop more than necessary. Culberson was quiet most of the first day, which Elias appreciated. He asked occasional questions, practical ones, about the road, about distances, but he kept the conversation sparse, and Elias got the impression of a man who was thinking hard about what he'd gotten himself into and had decided to see it through. They camped the first night at a creek crossing Elias knew, with good grass for the horses and clean water. Rosalie ate what she was given without comment, and was asleep inside 20 minutes, curled on her side near the fire with her coat pulled up. Culberson looked at her sleeping and then looked at Elias across the fire. "She was a nurse?" he asked. "At this home. A care worker, I think. Something like that. And she figured out what was happening to the children on her own. Her and a man named Daniel." Elias put another piece of wood on the fire. "He didn't make it out." Culberson was quiet for a moment. "The warrant Voss brought me was issued in Warren County, Pennsylvania, signed by a county judge I've never heard of." He looked at the fire. "I sent a telegram before we left, asked a colleague in the Eastern Territories to look into that judge's record." He paused. "I don't know what he'll find, but a man who comes this far west to chase a woman who's half dead and has no resources, that man is not collecting a criminal. That man is cleaning up a problem." "That's what I thought," Elias said. "It puts me in an uncomfortable position." Culberson said it without self-pity, just assessment. "If the warrant's legitimate, I have a legal obligation regardless of what I personally believe. If it's been manufactured," he shook his head. "I've been a lawman for 22 years, and I've never had to work out which side of a corrupt warrant I was on." "Which side are you on?" Culberson looked at him. "I'm on the side of finding out what's in that box," he said. "After that, we'll see." They reached the Laramie road crossing before noon on the second day. Elias saw the doubled trunk cottonwood before Rosalie pointed it out. It was hard to miss. Two thick trunks growing from the same root, leaning slightly toward each other like they'd been arguing for 50 years and hadn't worked it out. The dry creek bed cut under the road just past it, and the north bank was soft and deep with old root systems, the kind of ground that held things buried in it. Rosalie slid off her horse before he could help her, which he'd learned was just how she did things, and walked to the east root of the right-hand trunk. She crouched down and pressed her hand into the dirt at the base of it. Her hand was shaking slightly. He noticed and didn't say anything. "Here," she said. "About here." He unstrapped the short-handled shovel from his pack and handed it to her. She looked at it and then handed it back to him. "I can't dig with the ribs," she said. It came out flat, like it annoyed her to admit it. He crouched beside her and started to dig. The ground was harder than he expected in the top few inches, dry from the summer, but it softened as he went down. Culberson stood behind them, watching the road in both directions with the quiet attention of a man who'd spent a lifetime watching for things coming. 14 inches down, the shovel hit something. Not rock. The dull, solid thud of metal against something that had some give to it. Rosalie made a sound he'd never heard from her before. Small. Involuntary. Like something had been wound too tight for too long and had just released a fraction of an inch. He cleared the dirt with his hands, an oilcloth bundle, tied with cord that had gone dark with moisture but held. He lifted it out and set it on the ground. Rosalie cut the cord with his knife and unwrapped the oilcloth and opened the tin box beneath it. Inside, papers. Dozens of them. Some folded, some flat, all protected well enough by the oilcloth that they were legible, damp at the edges, stained in places, but readable. Columns of names, dates, figures, correspondence on letterhead that bore the name of Hollow Creek Home for Children and several other institutions and private parties, and in the middle of the stack, a ledger. Small and cloth-bound and water-warped at the corners, but intact. its pages still together, its entries still clear. Culberson crouched down beside them and picked up one of the letters. Read it for a moment. Read it again. His face went through something. Not surprise, exactly. The kind of expression that came from having suspected something and being presented with the proof of it and finding the proof worse than the suspicion. "How many children?" he asked. Rosalie was going through the ledger, her finger moving down the entries. Her face was doing nothing, completely still, which was worse, somehow, than if it had been doing something. 41, she said. In this ledger alone. Entries over 3 years. She turned a page. Some are marked with initials I don't recognize. Some have amounts next to them. She stopped on a page. Some just have a dash. Like whoever wrote this didn't bother to finish the notation. Because the child didn't arrive, Culberson said. His voice had gone quiet and even in a way that had a different quality from calm. She didn't answer that. She closed the ledger. This is enough, she said. This is everything. Boss. They made it back to the road and had ridden less than a quarter mile when the other riders appeared. 4 of them, coming from the east at a pace that meant they'd been waiting rather than traveling. Elias saw them and felt his stomach drop in a specific, cold way. Not panic, just the recognition of something he'd been hoping wouldn't happen happening. Caleb Voss was at the front. Behind him, 3 men who were not the same men as before. These were harder looking, with the economy of movement that meant they were comfortable with what they were carrying. Marshal Culberson, Voss said, pulling up 20 feet away. His voice was exactly the same as it always was. I wasn't aware of an authorized investigation in progress. Then you weren't paying close enough attention, Culberson said. I'd like to know on what authority. Mine, Culberson said, which at this moment is sufficient. He moved his horse slightly, putting himself between Voss's group and Rosalie without making it look deliberate. Mr. Voss, I'd ask you to stand down. I'm in the middle of an active. Hand over what she's carrying, Voss said. Not to Culberson, to Elias, looking past the marshal like he wasn't there. His voice had changed. The smoothness was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, like a surface over water, moving. Elias looked at him. No, he said. It was a simple word. Voss seemed to find it unexpected anyway. Mr. Crow, you are interfering with a lawful. You said that the last time, Elias said. I didn't believe it the last time, and I don't believe it now. Voss looked at him for a moment. Then his eyes moved to Rosalie, and this time whatever was underneath the smoothness came close enough to the surface to be visible. Not fury. Something more controlled than that, and worse for being controlled. Rosalie, he said, let's be reasonable about this. Whatever you think you have, whatever story you've put together in that damaged head of yours, it's not going to go the way you think it will. I have resources you cannot compete with. I have people in positions you cannot reach, and right now, right here, you have a choice between making this worse for yourself and what? She said. He stopped. Walking away? Her voice was steady, and she was looking at him directly, which seemed to bother him more than anything else had. You left me under a tree to die. You had men beat me until I couldn't remember my own name. You told everyone I was a criminal and chased me across the country. She had the tin box in the crook of her arm, and she was not going to let go of it. Whatever choice you think you're offering me, I don't want it. Something hardened in Voss's face. The pretense of reasonableness simply dropped, like a curtain falling. Take it, he said to his men. What happened next was fast and badly organized and nothing like the controlled confrontations in stories, where men stood apart and everything went in sequence. One of Voss's men spurred his horse forward, and Culberson cut him off, his own horse shouldering the animal sideways, and then the 2 of them were tangled together and cursing. Elias moved without thinking, putting himself directly in the path of the second rider, and the man pulled his horse up short and reached for his gun. Elias was off his horse and had the man's arm before the gun cleared the holster. They went down together into the road, and the ground was hard and not forgiving about it, and Elias took an elbow to the jaw that made the world go briefly white. He got the man's wrist and bent it back until the gun dropped, and then he knelt on the man's chest and looked up. Rosalie was still mounted. She hadn't moved her horse. And her horse, Elias's steady gray gelding, which he'd put her on specifically because nothing startled it, hadn't moved either. She had the box held tight to her body, and she was watching. The third of Voss's men had a rifle half raised and was pointing it in a direction that encompassed both Elias and Culberson, clearly uncertain who to commit to. Culberson had gotten his horse clear and had his own gun out. "You put that down," he said to the man with the rifle, quietly, with the tone of someone who has said the last reasonable thing they intend to say. A long, suspended second. The man put the rifle down. Voss sat on his horse and looked at the scene. His 3 men in various states of stopped, a marshal with a drawn weapon, Elias getting up from the ground with blood from his lip, and Rosalie on the gray gelding with her back straight and the box of evidence against her chest. And the expression on his face was something Elias filed away. Not the face of a man who had lost, the face of a man recalculating. "You understand what you're doing," Voss said. To all of them, to none of them. "You understand what this will bring down." "Take it as a yes," Culberson said. "Gentlemen, you will ride back the way you came. Mr. Voss, I would strongly recommend presenting yourself to my office in Black Hollow within 48 hours. If you don't, I'll issue my own warrant, and mine will be properly supported." He looked at Voss steadily. "We're done here." For a moment, Voss didn't move. Then he turned his horse. His men followed, 2 of them slowly. The third, the one Elias had put on the ground, limping back to his horse with a look that promised something unfinished. They watched them go until the road was empty. Elias wiped the blood from his lip with the back of his hand and looked at Culberson. "You all right?" "Fine." The marshal holstered his gun. He didn't look fine. He looked like a man who had just done something he'd been trained to avoid and was now living in the consequences of it. "You?" "I've had worse." They both looked at Rosalie. She was looking at the road where Voss had disappeared. Something in her face was still locked down tight. Whatever she was feeling about having stood in the open and said what she'd said and had it go the way it went. She'd been right that it would be this or worse. That didn't make it easy. "He'll come back with more people," she said. "Yes," Culberson agreed. "Then we need to move faster than he does." They made it back to Black Hollow in a day and a half, pushing harder than was comfortable for any of them. Rosalie didn't say a word about the ribs, which meant they were bad. He saw the way she held herself getting off the horse at the end of the second day, the careful breath before the movement, and he didn't comment on it. Culberson went directly to the telegraph office and sent 2 messages, one east, one to the territorial capital. He wouldn't say exactly what was in them, but he came out of the telegraph office looking like a man who'd made a bet and was waiting to see if it paid. Henry Pratt was still in Black Hollow, staying at the boarding house, and he came to meet them with the nervous energy of a man who'd committed to something and was simultaneously relieved and terrified that it was actually moving forward. They spread the documents on the table in Culberson's temporary office, a back room at the town hall, which smelled of old paper and lamp oil, and went through them systematically. Culberson was methodical about it. He sorted and he read and he made notes, and occasionally he asked Rosalie a question about a specific name or date or notation, and she answered what she could and was honest about what she couldn't. The ledger was the worst of it and the most important. The entries were in 2 hands, someone meticulous and someone less careful. And once you understood the shorthand, the record was clear. Children received, children placed, amounts paid, names of buyers that were sometimes full and clear, and sometimes initials that Rosalie worked through slowly, her face doing nothing, matching them against what she remembered of who had come to visit Hollow Creek with Caleb Voss's endorsement, with his letters of introduction, with his smooth assurances. "This one," she said, pointing to an entry. "RT. That's Reginald Thane. He came twice. He sat with the children at dinner, and afterward I didn't see 2 of the boys again." She turned the page. "And this, DHC, Voss called him a business associate. I don't know his full name." "I might," Culberson said. He was looking at a letter, not the ledger. "D.H. Crandall, commodity broker out of Denver. He's been involved in some things that never quite got to a trial." He set the letter down. "He's also a political donor in the territory." "That's how Voss has protected himself," Elias said. Culberson looked at him. He's not just running a criminal operation, Elias said. He's running it with people who have the connections to bury it. That's why a warrant comes out of a Pennsylvania county with a judge nobody's heard of. That's why he came out here personally instead of sending someone, because letting someone else handle this meant trusting someone else not to talk. He looked at the spread of papers on the table. He came to clean it up himself. Culberson sat back. Which means the people named in these documents have both the motive and the resources to make this extremely difficult. Yes, Rosalie said, which means I need federal backing before I move on any of the names in that ledger, or this gets suppressed faster than I can blink. He looked at her. That takes time. How much time? Weeks, maybe more. He said it carefully, watching her face. She absorbed it. And Voss doesn't wait weeks. No, he doesn't. Culberson put his hands flat on the table. Ms. Vane, I want to be very clear with you. I believe everything in front of me. I believe your account. What you've brought back is extraordinary. It's more than I expected and more than he expected you to have. And that's the only reason we got out of that road confrontation without it being worse. He looked at the ledger. But I cannot protect you indefinitely with territorial authority alone when the people in that book have the connections they have. I need federal weight behind this before I can move. And until I have it, she stays at the ranch, Elias said. Culberson looked at him. That's not a guarantee of safety. No, but it's better than a boarding house room with one door. He looked at Rosalie. We go back. We wait for what Culberson's telegrams bring back. If Voss comes, he paused. He's shown his hand now. He came at us on a public road with armed men in front of a marshal. That's not a man who's the people who can find out, Culberson said. She nodded. She took her hand off the page. She straightened up. All right, she said, we wait. But we do it with the originals locked somewhere Voss can't reach and copies in 2 other locations, and Henry Pratt's statement in writing before he rides home. She looked at Culberson. I'm not leaving any of this to one point of failure again. Agreed, Culberson said. Elias said nothing. He was watching her. The set of her shoulders, the decisions running behind her eyes, and thinking about the woman he'd found barely breathing under a sycamore tree 6 weeks ago and finding it difficult to connect those two things. Not because she had changed exactly, more like the first version of her had been what was left after everything else had been stripped away, and what was coming back, piece by piece, was considerable. They spent another hour at that table, and when they left Culberson's office, the sun was going down over the western ridge, turning the sky the color of old copper. Elias brought the horses around and Rosalie mounted carefully, and they rode back toward the ranch in the fading light, with the oilcloth bundles secured behind Elias's saddle, copies already made and distributed, Henry Pratt's written statement folded inside Culberson's coat. Neither of them said much on the ride home. There wasn't much that needed saying. They'd gone east with hope and a shovel and come back with proof and bruises and a fight that was far from over, and both of them knew it. Halfway home, with the ranch lights just visible in the distance, Rosalie reached into her coat pocket and took out the small wooden horse Lily had given her. She looked at it for a moment, riding one-handed, and then put it back. She hadn't lost it. Through all of it, the confrontation on the road, the hard ride back, the hour in Culberson's office going through documents that recorded the sale of children like livestock, she'd kept that small wooden horse in her pocket. Elias saw it and didn't say anything. But he thought, in the private way a man thinks things he hasn't decided how to say yet, that whatever had been keeping him going for the past 6 weeks through the worry and the complications and the long, exhausting business of standing between a woman he barely knew and people who wanted her gone, it was not going anywhere, and neither was she. The waiting was the hardest part. Elias had always known this about himself, that he was better at doing than at sitting still while other people did things. But the week after they returned from the Laramie Road made it worse than usual. There was nothing to do but tend the ranch and watch the road and trust that Culberson's telegrams had landed somewhere that mattered. He was not naturally a trusting man. He'd built most of his adult life on the premise that if something needed doing, you did it yourself, and handing the most important thing he'd been involved in for years over to a federal process he couldn't see or touch sat badly with him in a way he couldn't entirely work out. Rosalie handled the waiting differently. She worked. not the careful, managed activity of someone still recovering, though she was still recovering. The ribs were not right yet and wouldn't be for another few weeks. She worked the way a person worked when keeping their hands busy was the only reliable way to keep their head from going somewhere they couldn't afford to go. She fixed the kitchen floorboard that had been giving. She reorganized the root cellar with a thoroughness that embarrassed Elias, who hadn't gone through it since May died. She started a kitchen garden from seeds she found in the back of a shelf that he hadn't known were there, turning soil in the corner of the yard with a methodical patience that was genuinely something to watch. Lily followed her like a small shadow, which Rosalie accepted without comment and without the brittle edge of someone tolerating an intrusion. She just incorporated Lily into whatever she was doing. When she dug in the garden, Lily dug beside her with a stick. When she hung washing on the line, Lily held the corners. When she sat on the porch in the evening with a cup of tea that had gone cold because she kept forgetting to drink it, Lily sat beside her and talked about whatever Lily was thinking about, which ranged widely. Elias watched this from various distances and didn't know exactly what to do with what he felt about it, so he mostly didn't try. What he did do was ride into Black Hollow every 2 days to check with Culberson, who was operating out of the town hall back room with the patience of a man who had decided he was right and was prepared to wait as long as it took to be proven so. The marshal had received one response to his Eastern telegrams: confirmation that the Warren County judge who'd signed Voss's warrant was under separate investigation for unrelated matters, which Culberson said with the flat satisfaction of someone whose instincts had been vindicated. The federal response was slower, which was normal, and more uncertain, which was also normal and significantly more frustrating. "They're taking it seriously," Culberson told him on the 4th day. "I can tell by what they're not saying as much as what they are. When federal authorities are moving on something political, they don't confirm timelines." "How long?" "I don't know. A week, maybe 2. He looked at Elias steadily. "Has Voss made any moves?" "Not that I can see. No one's been near the ranch." "That worries me more than if he'd tried something." Elias thought about that on the ride home. A man like Voss, who had resources and connections and had spent the last months cleaning up a problem that could destroy him, going quiet was not the same as going away. It was the same as a fire that appeared to be out. You didn't stop watching just because you couldn't see the flame. He mentioned this to Rosalie that evening, and she nodded like he'd confirmed something she'd already worked out. "He's waiting for the federal response," she said. "He has contacts. He'll know when something's coming before we do, or he'll try to." She was sitting at the table, the wooden horse Lily had given her sitting at the edge of it within her sight line, which he'd noticed she did, kept it somewhere visible when she was thinking hard about something. If he has anyone inside the territorial office, he can move to suppress the evidence before an order comes through. "The copies," Elias said. "Culberson has one. Henry Pratt took one back east with him. The third is—" She glanced at him. After the road confrontation, they'd agreed on a third location, and it was not discussed openly. "It's where it is, but if Voss gets to the originals—" "He can't. Culberson's got them locked." "Culberson is one man in a town hall with a lock that any decent man with a toolkit could handle in 10 minutes. She wasn't being dramatic about it, just precise. "I'm not saying it's likely. I'm saying I think about it." "What do you want to do?" She was quiet for a moment. "I want it to be over," she said. "I want Culberson's federal backing to arrive, and I want Voss in front of a judge, and I want to know where Micah is." She picked up the cup of tea, set it down without drinking from it. "That's what I want. What I can actually do is make sure that if something goes wrong with one piece of this, the rest of it still holds." He leaned back in his chair. "You've been thinking about this all week, haven't you?" "Yes," he said, "but I've been thinking about it like a man watching a fence line." "You're thinking about it like someone who built the fence." She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "Is that a complaint?" "No, it's useful." He looked at the table. "I just noticed you don't stop." "I don't know how," she said. It came out matter of fact, without apology. "I tried when I was recovering those first weeks. I kept thinking I should just rest. Let it be. But my brain doesn't work that way. It keeps turning things over. A pause. May was probably different. The name landed in the room with a weight he hadn't expected. She'd never mentioned May before, and it took him a moment to understand she'd only known about her from Lily, who mentioned her mother occasionally in the unconscious way of children who have absorbed a loss they're too young to fully understand. She was, he said. May could put things down. She had a quality of settling. At the end of the day, she could just stop and be where she was. He looked at the window. I used to wonder how she did it. Did you ask her? Once. She said she just decided to, like it was that simple. He almost smiled. It was probably more complicated than that. She was just better at making it look simple. Rosalie was watching him. You miss her. Every day. He said it without hesitation. It's not. It doesn't stop you from anything. It just lives alongside everything else. She was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, she said. Not the reflexive kind of sorry, the kind that meant she'd understood something about what she was looking at. She would have liked you, he said, which surprised him as he said it, because he hadn't known he thought that until the words were out. But it was true. May had liked capable, direct people, and she'd had no patience for pretension. She would have watched Rosalie take the Hollow Creek ledger apart with both hands and would have approved of it immediately. Rosalie looked at the table. A small, complicated silence. I'm going to make more tea, she said. That actually gets drunk this time. Voss moved on the 8th day. Not toward the ranch, not toward Culberson. He moved in a direction none of them had anticipated, which in retrospect Elias thought they should have. He went to the town. Not in person. Voss was too careful for that now, too aware that Culberson was watching his movements. He worked through intermediaries, through the channels that money had always worked through in small frontier towns, and what he built over the course of 3 days was a story. A version of events that he seeded through careful conversations in the right places. The saloon, the feed store, the particular social corridors where Thomas Galt and the other self-appointed moral authorities of Black Hollow spent their time. The story was not a simple lie. It was more sophisticated than that. It acknowledged that some irregularities may have existed at Hollow Creek, that certain individuals might indeed face scrutiny, but it placed Rosalie not as a witness to those irregularities, but as a participant in them. A woman who had been aware of what was happening, who had perhaps been involved in facilitating some of it, and who had stolen the records not to expose the crime, but to use them as leverage, as protection for herself or for sale. It was the kind of story that couldn't be immediately disproved. It was the kind of story that planted questions rather than accusations, that made people tilt their heads and wondering was often enough. Elias heard the shape of it from Jim Alcott on the 9th day, delivered with the careful neutrality of a man who was telling him something because he thought he should know, not because he believed it. I'm not saying it's true, Alcott said. I'm saying it's going around. Elias drove home with that sitting in his chest like a stone. He told Rosalie that evening. He didn't want to, but she needed to know, and beyond that he had the strong conviction that she would find it worse to discover later that he'd held it back than to hear it now and deal with it. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. He's cutting the ground out, she said. If the community believes I was complicit, then when the federal case comes through, if it comes through, there's already a version of the story in place that diminishes the testimony of a survivor. She wasn't loud about it. She was just working it out. It's what you do when you can't destroy the evidence. You destroy the credibility of the person who found it. Yes. She stood up from the table and went to the window, stood there for a minute with her back to him, looking at the dark yard. I need to talk to people, she said. Rosalie, not about the case, not about Voss, just... She turned around. There are people in this town who've been told one version of who I am for weeks now. The worst version, and the only reason they believe it is that they've never heard anything else. She looked at him steadily. I'm not going to go to Thomas Galt's doorstep and argue with him, but there are people, the women mostly. Some of them have children. If they understood what Hollow Creek actually was, it could make things worse. If Voss sees you're moving, Voss is already moving. He moved 8 days ago, and we didn't know until today. She crossed her arms, not defensively. She did it when she was thinking, he'd learned. I'm not asking to hold a meeting at the town hall. I'm asking to have conversations with individuals, quietly. Like, she held his gaze. I spent 2 years taking care of other people's children. I know how to talk to mothers. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about all the ways it could go wrong and the specific way she was standing. Not asking permission, not looking for someone to tell her it was safe, just telling him what she was going to do. Not alone, he said. You can't come with me to a women's sitting room, Elias. Davis can drive you in, and you come back before dark. He held up a hand before she could respond. That's not negotiable. Not because I don't trust your judgment, because Voss has men whose faces we haven't seen yet. She considered it. All right. She went into Black Hollow 3 times in the following 5 days. He didn't go with her beyond dropping her and waiting at the livery. He didn't know exactly what was said in those conversations. She came back quiet, processing, the way she always was after something that had cost her. But he saw the results of it before she told him about them directly. The first sign was Delia Marsh, who stopped Elias outside the dry goods store on the 3rd day to say that she was sorry for how she'd behaved and that she hoped the woman at his ranch was recovering well. She said it quickly, like she'd been working up to it and wanted to get it done before she talked herself out of it. The second sign was harder to read. Thomas Galt on the street, who didn't speak to him but didn't avoid him either, which was different from the past 2 weeks. Just acknowledged him with a nod, the minimal gesture of a man who was reconsidering something and wasn't ready to say so. The third sign was a woman named Ruth Calloway, who had 5 children and whose husband ran the grain operation on the north edge of town, showing up at the ranch one morning with a covered dish and a look on her face that said she had come to say something specific and was not entirely sure how. She said it on the porch, in pieces, while Lily sat on the steps between them, pulling apart a pine cone. I've got children, Ruth Calloway said. 5 of them. And I've thought about what Ms. Vane said. About those children in that home. She stopped. I don't care what that man from back east is saying about her. If half of what she told me is true, another stop. It's not right. None of it is right. And I wanted her to know there are people in this town who aren't going to just stand by. And she ran out of sentence and looked at the covered dish in her hands. I made a pie, she said, slightly defeated. Elias took the pie. Thank you, Ruth. He told Rosalie that evening, and she sat with it for a moment in the way she sat with things that mattered, and then said, She has a boy about Micah's age. He didn't say anything to that. I told her about him, Rosalie said. I told her his name and that he liked having his bed checked for monsters before he slept, and that his laugh was that he laughed with his whole face, the kind of laughing that makes other people laugh even when nothing's funny. She was looking at the table. I told her he was 6 years old and his name was in a ledger. The room was quiet. She cried, Rosalie said. I didn't mean to make her cry, but she did, and I thought that was it. That's what this has to be. Not an argument about evidence and jurisdiction, just people understanding that these were real children, with names, with things they were afraid of. She looked up. Voss can tell a story about me. He can't make Ruth Calloway stop thinking about a 6-year-old boy named Micah. Oh. The federal response came on a Tuesday, 12 days after Culberson's telegrams. 2 federal marshals arrived on the afternoon stage from Cheyenne, and by the time Elias heard about it and rode into town, Culberson was already in a closed meeting with them at the town hall. He waited outside for nearly 2 hours, which was not enjoyable, and when Culberson finally came out, he looked like a man who had just set down something extremely heavy. They're moving, he said. Full investigation. Subpoenas for the Hollow Creek board members and all associated parties. The ledger and the correspondence are being transferred to federal custody tonight. He looked at Elias. Voss is going to know within the day. And? And there's a federal warrant being drafted for his arrest. But it takes time to execute, and if he runs... He stopped. He can't be allowed to run. Elias thought about this. Where is he now? Last known, still in Black Hollow, boarding house. Culberson looked at him steadily. I'd like to take him tonight before the warrant formally arrives, if he'll cooperate with a voluntary holding. But I can't do that without someone else present. One of the federal men will come, but I'll come. Elias, this is not your... Yes, it is, he said, not angry, just certain. Where do you want me? Yeah. Caleb Voss did not run. Elias thought about that afterward, whether Voss had calculated that running was worse, or whether some part of him had simply never believed it would get this far, that a woman he'd left for dead under a tree in Wyoming would put the whole thing together before he could contain it, that a territorial marshal, nobody special, would take his concerns seriously enough to go federal, that it would end in a boarding house room in a frontier town smaller than the company office he probably kept back east, with 2 marshals and a rancher standing in the doorway. He looked at Elias when they came in, specifically at Elias, ignoring the marshals for a moment, and said, "You've made an enemy." "I expect I have," Elias said. "The people involved in this are going to have their own problems shortly," Culberson said from behind Elias. "Mr. Voss, you can come with us now, or you can make this considerably more unpleasant for yourself." Voss came, quietly, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd fought it. He walked out of the boarding house and into the street with the control of a man who had decided to play the next phase of this out in courts, where he believed he still had advantages. And maybe he was right about that. Maybe the people in that ledger were protected enough that not all of them would face what they deserved. That was a reality Elias couldn't fix. It sat badly, but it was real. What he could say with certainty, riding back to the ranch that night, was that Caleb Voss was in custody, and the evidence was in federal hands, and Rosalie was at the ranch where Lily was probably already asleep, and the road between town and home was empty and dark and just road. He got back after midnight. The house had 1 light burning in the kitchen, which meant she'd waited up. He came in and she was at the table with a cup of tea that was this time still warm. She looked at his face and read it. "It's done," she said. "For now." He sat down. "Federal custody. 2 marshals from Cheyenne. The investigation is open." He looked at her. "It's going to take time. Trials take time. Some of the people in that ledger are going to hire lawyers that are better than the lawyers against them. I'm not going to tell you it ends perfectly." "I know." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "I stopped expecting perfect a long time ago." "But Voss is in a cell tonight." She looked at the table. Something moved through her face. Not relief exactly, because relief was too simple for something that had cost this much. More like a weight that had been distributed across too many weeks finally finding the ground. Not gone. Just settled. "The children in the ledger," she said. "The federal investigation, will they—" Culberson said it's part of the mandate. Finding them, or accounting for them. He held her gaze. "They're going to try." She nodded. Slow and careful, like she was letting herself believe that without letting it become more than she could carry if it turned out to be wrong. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When I wrote that letter to the Bureau, when I agreed to come west and—" She stopped, started again. "I was leaving because I was scared. I had the evidence and I knew it was only a matter of time before Voss found out how much I'd seen, and I needed to disappear somewhere far enough that he'd lose the thread." She looked at him directly. "I was not coming here because I thought I'd be a good wife, or because I had some picture of a different life. I was running." He looked at her. "I'm telling you that because you've done what you've done for the past weeks, and you deserve to know what you were actually taking on. What I actually was when I showed up. Not a bride with a letter. A woman running from something terrible and hoping the distance was enough." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I'm sorry that's what arrived at your door." He thought about what to say. Thought about the letter she'd written him, practical and clear and honest about wanting a new start. Thought about the woman under the sycamore tree, breathing when she shouldn't have been. "You were running," he said, "and you were also the woman who hid evidence of a crime against children before you ran, so that there'd be a record even if something happened to you." He looked at his hands on the table. "People run for all kinds of reasons. Most of them aren't as good as yours." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what I am to you," she said. It was the most unguarded thing she'd ever said to him, and he knew from the way she said it that it had cost her to get it out. "I know what the letter said. I know that was an agreement, and I know everything since then has— None of this is what either of us planned." "No," he said. "So I don't—" She stopped. I'm not asking you to. Another stop. She looked slightly frustrated with herself, which he found, in spite of everything, almost funny. This woman who could take a ledger apart and hold herself steady in the face of Caleb Voss and explain the mechanics of criminal evidence to a federal marshal was struggling with this sentence. I'm not going anywhere, he said. That's what I told you at the start, and it's still true. Elias, what you were when you arrived doesn't change what you are now. What you are now is, he thought about how to say it right and settled for honest, over-polished. You're the person who remembered a 6-year-old boy's laugh and told a woman in this town about it until she cried, because you knew that was the only way to make it real to her. You're the person who made a copy of the evidence and hid it separately, alone, before you had any backup, because you understood that a single point of failure was a risk you couldn't take. He looked at her steadily. That's not a woman who arrived running. That's a woman who arrived fighting. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet. The house was quiet. The ranch was quiet around them, in the deep particular way of late night in open country. Lily asked me this morning, she said, if I was going to stay. He felt something shift in the region of his chest. What did you tell her? I told her I didn't know yet. She held his gaze. I told her that was a question for grown-ups to sort out. And now you're sorting it out. I'm trying to. A pause. I want to stay. I want to say that plainly because I've spent too long not saying things plainly. I want to stay. I don't know if that's... I don't know what you want. I know what the letter was. I know that's not the same as now. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the grass the way it always did at this hour, the steady sound of it like something breathing. The letter was a beginning, he said. That's all it was ever going to be. Something in her face softened, not collapsed. She was not a person who collapsed, just softened, like a thing that had been held at a certain tension for a very long time, very carefully, finally allowed itself, by degrees, to ease. I need more tea, she said. Yeah, he said. Me too. The weeks that followed were not simple. Trials were not simple. The men named in the Hollow Creek ledger hired lawyers who were, as Elias had predicted, formidably well paid, and the proceedings stretched forward in ways that required Rosalie to give testimony twice, once in Black Hollow and once in a courtroom 3 days' ride away, which she traveled to with Culberson and came back from looking tired down to her bones but unbent. Caleb Voss was convicted on federal charges that fall. The sentencing was longer than some of the others. He had been the organizer, the connective tissue of the thing, and the federal prosecutors had built the case around that specifically. Some of the men in the ledger received lesser charges and lesser sentences, which was infuriating and also the reality of how courts worked when money was involved, and Rosalie said so clearly to Culberson and then accepted it with the grimness of someone who understood that partial justice was still movement. 11 of the 41 children named in the ledger were located in the months following the investigation. Some had been placed in legitimate homes by individuals who hadn't fully understood what they were part of. A few were in county care facilities in 2 different states. Micah, the 6-year-old, was found in a farmstead in Nebraska in November, placed with a family who had paid for him and who, under the weight of federal investigation, surrendered him without the legal fight their lawyer had initially threatened. Culberson told Rosalie in person in the kitchen of the ranch on a gray November morning. She sat with it for a long moment. Then she asked, "Is he all right?" "He's alive," Culberson said carefully. "He'll need time." She nodded. She was already thinking about what time meant and what was needed and what she could do about it. Elias could see it from across the room, the same thing he'd seen from the beginning, that her brain did not stop, that caring was for her a verb that implied action and not just feeling. "There are others still unaccounted for," she said. "Yes," Culberson said. "Then it's not over." "No," he said, "not entirely." She looked at Elias across the kitchen. He looked back at her. "Then we keep going," she said. It was not directed at any one person in the room. It was just what she said, the same way she'd said everything through all of it. without drama, without asking whether it was possible, already moving toward the next thing that needed doing. Elias thought, not for the first time, that he was looking at the bravest person he'd ever met. Not in the way people use that word for soldiers or men who did violent things in difficult terrain, in the specific and demanding way that applied to someone who had been broken in the worst way and had gotten back up and used the understanding of what breaking felt like to make sure fewer people fell through the same cracks. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in her winter coat, which she'd put on herself and gotten wrong, one button off, the hem uneven. She looked at the assembled adults with the assessment of a 5-year-old who could tell a room was serious and was choosing to interrupt it anyway. "Can we go see Biscuit?" she asked Rosalie. "He's been alone all morning." Rosalie looked at her, at the coat done up wrong, at the absolute confidence that the answer would be yes. "Let me fix your buttons first," she said, and crossed the room to do it. Micah arrived on a Thursday in late November, 3 days before the first real snow of the season. He came with a federal agent named Sorensen, who had driven him from Nebraska in a wagon that smelled of pine resin and old leather, and who handed him over at the ranch gate with the brisk efficiency of a man completing a transfer of paperwork rather than a child. Micah stood in the yard and looked at the unfamiliar ground under his feet and didn't say anything. He was 7 now. His birthday had passed somewhere in the months nobody had been watching over him. And he was smaller than Rosalie remembered. Or maybe she had grown the memory of him larger than he actually was, the way you did with things you'd lost. She crouched down in front of him, the same way she always crouched down for Lily, coming to where a child was rather than making them come up to her. "Micah," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were dark and watchful, in the specific way of children who have learned that new places meant new rules, and new rules meant you watched carefully before you moved. "You probably don't remember me," she said. "I worked at Hollow Creek. I used to check under your bed." Something moved through his face that's small and quick, like light through a gap. "You said there weren't any monsters," he said. His voice was careful, testing the sentence before trusting it. "I did," she said. "I was mostly right." He looked at the ranch behind her, at the fence and the barn and the smoke coming from the chimney, and Lily standing on the porch with both hands on the railing, watching him with the focused attention of a child who has decided she needs more information before she knows what to think. "Is this where I'm staying?" he asked. "For now," Rosalie said, "if you want to." He thought about it with the gravity of someone for whom that question had not always had a good answer. "Okay," he said. He was not an easy child to have in the house. Elias had not expected him to be and was not surprised. But it was still an adjustment, the kind that required patience he hadn't known he had left over after 4 years of solo parenting. Micah was quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. He startled at sounds. He ate fast, the reflexive speed of someone who'd learned that food didn't always wait, and it took weeks before he slowed down enough to actually taste what was in front of him. He didn't cry, which Rosalie said to Elias one night was more worrying than if he had, because children who'd been through what he'd been through needed to cry, and the ones who couldn't were carrying it somewhere internal where it did more damage. She knew what she was talking about. He trusted that. What helped Micah was unexpectedly the animals. Lily had been right that Biscuit had opinions, and one of those opinions, apparently, was that small, frightened people deserved particular gentleness. The horse that bit most adults who reached for him without introduction stood still for Micah from the first morning and let the boy lean against his neck without moving. Elias watched this from the fence and said nothing about it to anyone because some things didn't need analysis. Within 2 weeks, Micah was feeding Biscuit every morning. Within a month, he was helping Davis with the other horses, moving around the barn with a quiet purpose that was the first real ease Elias had seen in him. He didn't talk much, but he talked to the horses, and Elias could occasionally hear him through the barn wall, a low, continuous murmur of words he wasn't projecting for any human audience. Lily approached the situation of Micah with the pragmatism of a child who had decided he was going to be her friend and was simply waiting for him to catch up to that conclusion. She didn't crowd him. She made him aware of things he might find useful, where Rosalie kept the good cookies, which floorboard to avoid at night because it was loud, that Davis was grumpy before breakfast but fine after, and then left him to do with the information what he wanted. It was, Elias thought, a more sophisticated social strategy than most adults managed. By December, they were building something together in the corner of the barn. He didn't ask what it was. He could see it was important. Rosalie had been writing letters since October. Not to friends. She didn't have many of those, which was one of the costs of the kind of work she'd done and the kind of running she'd been doing before Wyoming. She wrote to the federal investigators handling the Hollow Creek case, detailed follow-up correspondence about the 30 children still unaccounted for, pressing on specific entries in the ledger that she'd cross-referenced against county records she'd requested through Culberson. She wrote to charitable institutions in 3 states asking about intake records from the previous 2 years. She wrote to a woman named Frances Coate, who ran a legal aid organization in Denver that had been involved in a similar case years earlier, and who had, apparently, information and contacts that were relevant. She did this at the kitchen table after Lily and Micah were asleep, in the specific concentrated silence of the ranch at night, with a lamp that she turned up too high and that gave her headaches she didn't mention. Elias started putting a second lamp on the table without saying anything about it, and she used it without commenting on where it had come from. He watched this operation, the letters, the records, the careful indexing of information, and understood that what he was watching was not grief transformed into productivity, which was how people usually described something like this. It was more purposeful than that. Rosalie had looked at the 30 children she couldn't account for and had made a decision that they were her problem to solve, not in the sense of blame, but in the sense of responsibility, the kind you chose rather than the kind that was assigned to you. He thought about that a lot. The difference between obligation and choice. He'd spent the past months doing things for her that no one had asked him to do, that no letter had obligated him to do, and he'd done them without needing to think hard about why. The why had been obvious from the first morning he'd found her under that tree and felt the weight of a choice that simple and that consequential arrive in front of him without warning. Some things you did because they were right, and the rightness was not complicated, even when the doing of them was. He proposed to her in January, not romantically, because that was not how either of them operated, and because the arrangement between them had never been built on romance. It had been built on something that was, he thought, actually sturdier. Practical compatibility. Shared values that had been tested by real circumstances rather than imagined ones. A specific and particular trust that came from having watched each other in the worst possible conditions and found nothing that made you want to look away. He said it at the kitchen table, which was where they'd had every important conversation, because that was just where they ended up. "I'd like you to marry me," he said. "The actual version, not the letter version." She looked up from what she was writing. "The actual version," she repeated. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, not the uncertain kind of quiet, the kind where she was deciding how to say what she already knew. "You understand what you're getting," she said. "It's not just me. There's Micah now, and the letters, and probably more after that. This ranch is going to become something neither of us fully planned." "I know. And you want that." "I want you," he said. "The rest of it comes with you, so yes." She looked at him across the table. In the lamplight, her face was the face he'd been looking at for months now, the one that was watchful and direct, and occasionally almost funny, and very rarely soft, and he had learned to read all of it with the fluency that came from paying attention. "Yes," she said. "That's it? What did you want? A speech?" "No," he said. "That's enough." They were married in March when the ground was just starting to soften and the first green was showing at the base of the fence posts. Culberson rode out from town to witness it along with Jim Alcott and Ruth Calloway, who brought her youngest and spent most of the brief ceremony managing him rather than watching it, which was fine. It was a quiet thing. Elias didn't need it to be large. Lily wore a dress with a yellow sash that she'd had opinions about for 3 weeks, and stood next to Micah on the porch, looking solemn and important and slightly sunburned from the March wind. Micah had combed his hair, which Elias noted, and filed under things he would not embarrass the boy by remarking on. Afterward, there was food that Ruth Calloway had organized because Ruth Calloway organized things, and Culberson shook Elias's hand with the warm grip of a man who was genuinely glad for someone, and told Rosalie she was the most formidable witness he'd ever had in any case and that he hoped never to need her services again, which made her laugh, the real laugh, the one that came out before she could decide whether to let it. Spring brought 3 more children, not through the federal investigation, though that was still ongoing. 2 of the 30 unaccounted for had been located by February and were in appropriate placements, and the case continued to move through the courts in ways that required Rosalie's periodic attention and made federal attorneys write her careful, formal letters that she answered with considerably less formality. The 3 children in the spring came through Francis Coate in Denver, who had been working with county authorities in 2 states to place children from overlapping cases. Not Hollow Creek specifically, but from the same network of institutions that the investigation had exposed, a network that turned out to be larger and older than anyone had initially understood. Francis wrote to Rosalie because Rosalie had been writing to her for months, and because Francis was a practical woman who recognized another practical woman when she was corresponding with one, and she said flatly in her March letter, "You clearly have space and capacity and the relevant experience, and I have 3 children who need somewhere to be while their legal situations are sorted out. The oldest is 9. The youngest is 5. Do you want them or not?" Rosalie showed Elias the letter over breakfast. He read it again. 3, he said. Temporarily, she said, while their placements are worked out. Francis thinks 2 months, maybe 3. And the 3rd bedroom. Davis has been sleeping in the bunkhouse anyway. He said himself the bunkhouse is fine. I know he said that. He was being polite. He wasn't actually. He prefers it. He told me the house is too loud. She held his gaze. Elias. He looked at the letter. He looked at the ranch he'd built for 2 people, and that now held 4, and was being asked to hold 7. He was a man who had spent 8 years building a life around practicality and emotional self-sufficiency, who had believed, after May, that the quieter things became the more manageable they were, who had written a letter to a correspondence bureau because he needed help, and had not known how to need it without framing it as a transaction. He thought about Lily at the window at dusk, looking at the road. He thought about Micah talking to horses in the dark. He thought about the 30 children in a ledger, and the ones they'd found, and the ones they hadn't yet. Write back to Frances, he said. Tell her yes. The children came in April, and their names were Clara, Joseph, and a girl of 5 who had been called by 2 different names in 2 different places, and who, after some time, decided she wanted to be called Wren, which everyone accepted without discussion because she'd clearly thought about it and it suited her. The ranch in summer held 7 people and was loud in a way that took Elias several weeks to adjust to, and that he eventually stopped trying to adjust to and simply accepted. The dinner table required a second bench. The morning routine involved a choreography of competing needs that Rosalie managed with the systematic calm of someone who had organized institutional care for years and found a family of 7, while demanding, at least personally motivated in a way that institutions never were. Clara was 9 and had the wariness of an oldest child who'd learned early that adults were unreliable. She warmed to Rosalie first, which made sense. Rosalie didn't promise things she couldn't deliver, and Clara had a finely calibrated detector for empty promises that had been built through disappointment. Joseph was 7 and loud and broke 2 things in the first week, and was so obviously horrified by this that Elias spent more energy reassuring him than he did being annoyed by the breakage. Wren was 5 and went immediately and completely to Lily, who received this with the benevolent authority of someone who had been waiting for a younger sibling and was now proceeding to be one. It was not easy. That needs to be said plainly, because the story of what the Crow Ranch became could be told in a way that made it sound inevitable and smooth, and it was neither of those things. There were nights that summer when Rosalie sat on the porch after the children were asleep, with the look of someone who was running the numbers on what they'd taken on, and wasn't entirely sure the numbers worked. There were mornings when Elias was up at 4 because one of the children had nightmares, and he'd sit in the dark with a child who didn't know him well enough yet to be fully comforted by him and do his best with what he had, which was presence and patience and the willingness to be there even when being there wasn't enough yet. There were arguments between him and Rosalie, the real kind, about money and decisions, and what they could sustain and how. She thought he was too protective of the children in ways that didn't serve them. He thought she moved too fast and burned herself out, and didn't ask for help when she needed it. Both of them were partially right and partially wrong about these things, which was the reality of two people who were strong-willed and had learned their habits alone and were now trying to fit those habits into a shared life. They worked through it, not gracefully every time, not without raised voices and doors closed harder than necessary, and the occasional night when someone slept on the wrong side of something. But they worked through it because the other option was not working through it, and neither of them was built for that. That was the thing about them, Elias thought. They were not built for quitting. In the specific way of people who had been through things that should have broken them and hadn't quite, they knew what it felt like to hold on when holding on was unreasonable. And so holding on when it was merely difficult felt like the obvious choice. By the following spring, the Crow Ranch had a name. Not an official name, nothing filed with the county or put on a sign. Just what people in Black Hollow had started calling it, the way small towns named things through accumulated usage. They called it the Crow Place, which it had always been called. But they started adding, where Rosalie takes in the children. And after a while, the second part became assumed, and then it became what the place was known for, the same way some places were known for their cattle or their water or their particular piece of high ground. Frances Coate came out from Denver in May, the first time she'd made the trip in person, and spent 3 days at the ranch conducting what she called an informal review in the brisk tone of a woman who reviewed things for a living and saw no reason to pretend this visit was purely social. She watched how the children were managed and ate dinner at the crowded table and asked questions that were direct and occasionally uncomfortable and wrote things in a notebook that she didn't share. On her last morning, she sat with Rosalie on the porch with coffee and said, "You could make this formal, a licensed placement. The county would support it financially, not generously, but enough to make the numbers work better than they currently do." "I've thought about it," Rosalie said. And the moment it's formal, it becomes institutional. There are rules about what you can do and when and how, and some of those rules are good rules, but some of them are the rules that let places like Hollow Creek exist for years before anyone noticed. She held the coffee cup. "I want to keep being able to make decisions based on the individual child, not a policy." Frances looked at her for a moment. "You know you can't save all of them." "I know. The ones you can't reach, the ones still in that ledger who we haven't found, you're going to carry those." "I already do." "It gets heavier." "I know that too." Rosalie looked at the yard where Micah and Joseph were doing something with a rope that appeared to involve the fence post in a knot neither of them could make correctly. Wren was sitting on the bottom porch step, drawing in the dirt with a stick. Lily was somewhere with Clara, who had discovered in the past months that she liked horses nearly as much as Micah did. "But the ones I can reach are here," she said, "and that's enough to keep going." Frances wrote something in her notebook, then she closed it. "I'm going to send you 2 more," she said, "when you have space." "All right," Rosalie said. Boom. In June, Elias found the wooden horse. He'd been fixing the board in the back of the wardrobe. It had been loose since winter, and he'd been getting to it in the way that small repairs got gotten to, which was slowly. And the horse had fallen from the high shelf where Rosalie kept it, tucked behind a folded cloth. It landed on the floor, and he picked it up and turned it over in his hand. The paint was worn on the neck where it had been held. One ear had a small chip he didn't remember. He brought it to her that evening when the children were in bed and the house had settled into its nightly quiet, which was still loud by most people's standards, but had become normal enough that they didn't register it as noise anymore. She looked at it in his hand. "Lily gave you that," he said, "before we rode east for the ledger. I remember. She said it was good luck. She was right." Rosalie took it from him, looked at it for a moment in the way she looked at things that had weight to them. "Do you know what I thought about, riding out that morning? You and me and Culberson and 2 days of road between us and whatever was or wasn't buried under that tree?" "What?" "I thought, if this doesn't work, if the box is gone, or the evidence isn't enough, or Voss has too many people in the right places, I will have had this." She turned the small horse over. "The ranch, Lily, you." She looked up. "I thought I will have had 3 weeks of something that felt like a life, and that's more than I had any right to expect when I got on that stage east." He looked at her. "I'm not saying I was ready to give up," she said. "I wasn't. I don't know how to give up, which is its own kind of problem. but I'd made a kind of peace with the possibility that it might not work. A pause. And then it worked. And now there are 7 people in this house, and the dinner table needs a 3rd bench, and I still haven't fixed the garden fence, and she stopped, looked at the small wooden horse in her palm. And I don't know what I did to deserve any of it, so I've stopped trying to figure that out, and I'm just trying to do right by it. He sat down beside her. You don't deserve it in the sense of having earned it, he said. Nobody earns the good things that way. You made room for it. You kept going long enough for it to find you. She looked at him. That's the most philosophical thing you've ever said. Don't get used to it. She almost smiled. Then she did smile. The full one. The one he'd heard before he'd seen it that day in the sick room when Lily told her about biscuit-biting people. I'm going to put this back where it was, she said, meaning the wooden horse. You should give it to Lily. It was hers. She gave it to me. That means it's mine now. She stood up. There's a difference. He thought about that after she went inside, about things given and things earned and the large territory of human experience that sat between those 2 categories and didn't have a clean name, about a letter written at a kitchen table by a man who didn't know how to ask for help without making it a transaction, and a woman who wrote back because she needed to disappear and chose his direction to disappear in, and how those 2 particular acts of calculated desperation had collided under a sycamore tree and become something neither of them had planned. He thought about May, who would have laughed at the improbability of it, who had believed in her quiet, settled way that life had a logic that you couldn't always see while you were inside it, only in the retrospective, that the things that looked like accidents from the middle of them revealed their necessity from the far end. He didn't know if he believed that entirely, but he could see the shape of something like it when he looked at the past year from where he was sitting. Beneath the old sycamore at the edge of the creek bed, in July, the family had a picnic. It was Lily's idea. She had been told, in the simplified way you told a child important things, that Rosalie had been found there, that the tree was significant. She had decided, with the logic of a 6-year-old, that significant places deserved to be celebrated rather than avoided, and she had campaigned for the picnic with a persistence that wore down every objection. So they went, all 7 of them, with a blanket and food and the specific chaotic energy of 5 children and 2 adults in an outdoor space with no walls to contain anyone. Micah found a frog immediately and held it up for Joseph's inspection. Wren sat in Rosalie's lap and ate an apple and watched the creek bed with the quiet attention she brought to most things. Clara and Lily were upstream doing something that involved sticks and water and competitive argument. Elias sat against the sycamore trunk and watched all of it. He thought about the morning he'd ridden this fence line with Lily on the saddle in front of him and seen the shape of something wrong under this tree. How the world had been one thing in the moment before Lily said, "Papa, what's that?" and a different thing in every moment after. How the fulcrum of a life could be something that small, a child's voice, a glance at the right angle, a decision made in the space of 10 seconds that you couldn't take back and wouldn't if you could. He'd been a man living alone with a child he loved, and a ranch he maintained, and a grief he'd learned to carry the way you carried something heavy for long enough, by not thinking too much about the weight. He hadn't known he was missing anything, or he'd known and had decided not to press on it, which was different, and maybe worse. He was not that man anymore. He was not sure he could describe clearly the man he was now, because the person you were in the middle of a life was always harder to see than the person you'd been. But he knew the house was full, and the table was crowded, and the mornings were loud, and the nights were sometimes hard, and the woman he'd married was currently arguing gently with Wren about whether you could eat a second apple before you'd finished the first one, and he would not have traded any of it. Not a morning of it. Not a single overcrowded dinner. Rosalie looked up from Wren and caught him looking at her. She raised an eyebrow. The expression that meant, "What are you thinking?" He shook his head slightly. "Nothing. Everything. I don't know." She held his gaze for a moment, and he could see her reading him the way she read everything, carefully, without rushing, willing to sit with the thing until it became clear. Then something in her face settled into the expression he had come to think of as hers in the deepest sense. Not happiness exactly, which was too simple and too temporary, but something more durable. A kind of rightness. The look of a person who has survived long enough to arrive somewhere real. She looked back at Wren and the apple question. Elias leaned his head back against the bark of the sycamore and looked up through the leaves at the July sky, which was the specific blue of midsummer in Wyoming, clear and enormous and indifferent to everything below it, in the way that only very large things could be. He thought about what Rosalie had said on the porch with her coffee. "I don't know what I did to deserve any of it." He thought about the answer he'd given her, which was true as far as it went, but wasn't the whole of what he believed. What he believed, if he was honest, was something simpler and harder to say. That goodness was not a reward system. That suffering did not entitle you to ease, and ease did not imply you'd earned it. That Rosalie had been beaten and left for dead under this tree, not because of anything she deserved, but because she'd been in the way of people who didn't care what she deserved. And that she had survived it, not because survival was guaranteed for the good, but because she had been stubborn and lucky, and someone had happened to ride a fence line at the right hour of the right morning. Luck and stubbornness. That was the whole of it. That was what he had to work with. But here was what he also believed, sitting with his back against the tree that had been the end of one thing and the beginning of another. That what you did with the luck was yours. That the stubbornness was yours. That every choice made after the surviving, to stay or go, to speak or be silent, to open the door or keep it closed, those were not accidents. Those were the shape of a person. Rosalie had made a box of evidence and hidden it under a root in hard ground, alone, before she had any reason to believe she'd survived long enough for it to matter. That was not luck. That was who she was. He had gotten off his horse and gone to the shape under the tree when the easier thing would have been to look away. That was not luck either. You could not control what arrived at your door. You could not control who you found under a tree, or what they carried, or what came after them. You could only control what you did when they arrived, whether you knelt down, whether you stayed. That was the whole lesson of the past year, if there was a lesson, and it was not complicated. You stayed. You stayed when it was hard, and you stayed when it was uncertain, and you stayed when the sensible thing and the safe thing pointed in the opposite direction. You stayed because the alternative was a version of yourself you couldn't live in without cost. You stayed because there was a child in the house who needed someone to stay, and a woman who had spent her whole life in places where people didn't. And you stayed because you were the kind of man, it turned out, who stayed, even when you hadn't known that about yourself until it was tested. He hadn't known what he was made of until this past year put him in a position to find out. He was glad of what he'd found. Micah's frog escaped and caused a brief uproar that involved all 5 children and resolved itself when the frog disappeared into the creek grass, at which point Micah pronounced it had gone home, and this determination was accepted by everyone. Clara, coming back from upstream with her hair wind-tangled and her boots wet, sat down next to Elias without asking and leaned against the sycamore beside him with the ease of a child who had slowly, over months, decided that this was a place where you could do that. Lean against something and trust it to hold. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. Rosalie was laughing at something Lily had said, the full laugh, clear and unguarded. Wren had fallen asleep against her arm with the second apple still in her hand, abandoned in favor of unconsciousness. The creek ran over its stones with the steady, unremarkable sound it had always made and would make long after all of them. The sycamore cast its shade across the blanket, and the children and the 2 people who had found each other in the worst possible way and made something from it anyway, not because the world rewarded that kind of effort, because it didn't, not reliably, not without cost, but because they were the kind of people who could not look at something broken and walk past it. Some people were made that way. It was not a comfortable way to be made. It asked a great deal and did not always return what it asked. But on a July afternoon under an old tree at the edge of a Wyoming creek, with 5 children and a husband and the sound of water and wind and the specific ordinary noise of a family that had been assembled from broken pieces and imperfect people, and 1 letter written in halting script at a kitchen table. On that afternoon, in that particular hour, it returned enough. It returned more than enough. And Rosalie Crow, who had come west running and stayed west fighting and made a home from the kind of hard ground that didn't give easily, leaned her cheek against the top of Wren's sleeping head and looked at the sky and thought, yes, this is the one. Not perfect, not uncomplicated, Not the life she'd planned or the one she'd imagined when she'd written back to a man she'd never met in Wyoming territory. Just real. Just hers. Just exactly enough.